Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and as you can see, I am joined by returning guests and special guests, Alex Mercouris and Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou of the Duran. Welcome, guys. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Delighted to be here again, Danny, and we got lots to talk about, but it's always great to talk about it with you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Danny.
Great. Yes, great to have you back on. Before we get started, everybody, please do hit the like button to boost this stream in the algorithm. At the end of the program, I will make sure to link to Alex and Alexander's channel on the Duran. And you can find in the video description ways to support this channel as well. I want to say hello to all of the moderators and, of course, all of the viewers. Thank you so much for tuning in. So let's get started. I guess the rolling development, the news that has been kind of, at least when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, the news that's been the biggest has been, of course, the concert hall attack, the Crocus City Hall concert attack. Now the death toll from this terrorist attack is up to, I believe, 143 people. There's been some breaking news from the Russia Investigation Committee, the Russian investigators in charge of finding out what exactly happened. Of course, there have been many detained already, and it appears that the Russian investigators are drawing linkages to Ukrainian nationalists, especially in regard to financing relating to cryptocurrency and the like. Of course, this may not come as a surprise, given that several of the perpetrators were fleeing to the Ukrainian border via the Bryansk region. So I'll just kick it to whoever wants to begin. What is the significance of this, especially in lieu and in light of all that you guys have been covering with regard to this conflict? Why is this, especially, and maybe you can answer this question, but why is this attack different than maybe others that we have seen, whether it's attacks that Ukraine has definitely committed, terrorist attacks on Russian territory, or just the landscape of terrorism in general?
Well, if I can start, in some ways, it is very like other attacks that have been committed. I mean, there have been Islamist attacks in Europe. You haven't had them so much in the US, but in Europe, there have been several occasions when Islamist terrorists have carried out attacks of this kind. They've stormed buildings, they've killed large numbers of people, they've aimed to kill large numbers of people. It's happened in the city where I live, which is in London in 2006. As I remember, they exploded devices in the London metro. Lots of people were killed at that time. So the indiscriminate, violent nature of this attack is consistent with the behavior of Islamist terrorists. And we've had claims from AMAC, which is the news agency that is connected to ISIS, that ISIS is responsible. We've had videos shown by AMAC which show the actual attack taking place. All of this is very consistent with what terrorists of this kind would be expected to do. But then there are the anomalies, and they do exist. And I think it's important to say that we don't know how significant these anomalies are at the moment, but they do exist. And people in the West who deny that they exist are not being frank or not well informed. Firstly, these four gunmen very quickly identified, very quickly captured. Now, that isn't consistent with the way in which gunmen who carry out these kind of attacks behave. Normally, they're carefully selected, they're highly trained, they're highly motivated, they're carefully prepared. Often they're wearing suicide vests. Their reward is martyrdom. They expect to go to heaven. That's what they're told will happen if they carry out one of these attacks. It's an affirmation of faith. They're holy warriors. They're not expected to survive these attacks. These four gunmen did aim to survive. They left the building. They got into a car, they fled, and of course they fled towards the Ukrainian border. And that is unusual. And when the Russian authorities caught up with them, instead of fighting to the death, as these people tend to do, when they're cornered, they allow themselves to be caught. And they have been caught, and they have been talking. So this is anomalous. This is not typical of these kind of attacks. Now, there might be explanations. It might be that ISIS is declining, ISIS is becoming different, but it is strange. And going back to this linkage that the Russians are making, the key point about this is two things. Firstly, obviously, this is happening in the middle of an armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians have made attacks on Russian territory, not of this nature, not on this scale, but there have been attacks. And secondly, these people were fleeing towards the Ukrainian border. Now, so far, there's not been much explanation of that or much discussion of it in the West.
Yeah, Alexander, spot on. The West is not talking about the fact that the terrorists were making their way to the border. They don't want to mention that. All they say is Ukraine has nothing to do with this, and it's ISIS. We're 100% convinced that it's ISIS. Ukraine has nothing to do with this. So that's been the narrative from everyone in the collective West, whether it's the Biden White House, whether it's Macron or the UK or Schultz. That's the script that they've been handed, and that's what they're going with. Maybe they're right. Maybe Ukraine has nothing to do with this. Maybe ISIS-K, not even ISIS-K is behind this. But the investigation is moving very quickly, and I think we'll find out in a matter of days or at most weeks exactly what's going on. But everything is pointing to some sort of Ukraine involvement. The cryptocurrency is actually interesting. That's very interesting. I'm on Zero Hedge right now. I'm sorry. FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried sentenced to 25 years in prison. Remember FTX in Ukraine and all the crypto stuff that was going on in Ukraine with all the FTX and United 24, which is the charity organization that was set up for Zelensky, which was taking donations in Bitcoin. I don't know. I don't know if any of this is connected, but crypto and Ukraine, obviously they have something going on there as well. So I don't know, but that's an interesting angle, the whole crypto, paying them in crypto. I think that's pretty interesting, but we'll see. We'll see what's going on here. The Russians are going to get to the bottom of this, and I think that's worrying the U.S. I would just say this, Danny. Me and Alexander did a show on this topic, and that should be up by tomorrow. But if it was me advising the Biden White House, as far as their communications department, at least, I would have told the Biden White House when this tragedy happened. I would have said, look, come out with a statement, condemn this terrorist act, send your condolences to the people of Russia. Tell the Russians that you're going to work with them in order to catch these guys. Say something along the lines of, despite our conflict or despite our tensions or whatever however you want to phrase it, we're going to work together with the Russian authorities in order to catch these terrorists. And just leave it there. Leave it there. Why they talked ISIS, why they talked Ukraine, I have no idea why they brought all of this into it. Even if they know something, even if they have information that it's ISIS-K or Ukraine's not involved, whatever, even if they have this information, I don't know why they brought it up right away a couple of hours after the terrorist attack. That would have been how I would have handled it, but what do I know?
I would just quickly add to that they brought up the denial that Ukraine was involved before anyone in Russia, in authority, had alleged that Ukraine was involved.
Why?
I mean, it was most odd.
Yeah, why, Alexander? Why, Danny? Why bring that up?
I think it was within 55 minutes, actually, of the reports that this attack happened. That's what you had. And I mean, there's Kamala Harris going in front of, the biggest of mainstream media saying exactly that. It's ISIS-K. It's not Ukraine. And of course, you've had Maria Zakharova and numerous Russian officials talk about how this is very suspicious, that there's already this deniability, this denial coming out, when I think I heard you, Alexander, say this in a program, that they're not a party to the matter, the event. There's no way that the United States could have known unless, and now we're hearing this kind of back and forth from Russia and the United States. The United States said, we warned you, right? We warned you. We wanted to warn you. We warned you, but you didn't want to listen to us. And Russia has been saying, no, absolutely not. You're trying to blackmail us by saying that you wanted to warn us, but in fact, your actions and behaviors has led to the deterioration of any kind of counterterrorism cooperation. So, I mean, I'll just throw that out if Alexander or Alex.
Well, absolutely. I mean, no, we've even had an article now about all of this in the New York Times, because just going back to that original warning, which we haven't seen the warning, we don't know what exactly the Americans privately were saying to the Russians. What we do know is what the two embassies, the American and British embassies in Moscow, said. And they warned American and British citizens in Moscow that there was a real danger of a terrorist incident within the next 48 hours, and that they should stay away from public gatherings, including concerts. That was what they said. Now, they said extremists. They didn't say Islamist extremists, for example. That is not in the warning. They were very vague about the warning itself was a bit vague. And of course, it was limited to 48 hours. Now, this attack took place several weeks after that warning was given. So it did not happen within the 48-hour period of the warning itself, the public warning. And if you were an American or a British citizen in Moscow, you might have said to yourself, well, the warning period has expired, so why shouldn't I attend a concert? Just saying. Now, what the Americans said to the Russians and what the Russians said to the Americans in private, we don't really know. But the New York Times suggests that the Americans weren't saying very much, probably not much more than what that public warning that was made on the 7th of March said. And this is a product of the total collapse in the relationship between these two countries. So even on a question of intelligence cooperation to fight terrorism, they're not cooperating and working together anymore. So the Americans aren't giving the Russians all the information they have, and the Russians don't trust the very incomplete information that the Americans are giving them.
Yeah, I think this New York Times article's not helping the Biden White House. I understand why they're running it. They're trying to explain away what happened, because when the terrorist attack happened, Kirby came out, and in one of his first statements, he did send his condolences. The Biden White House did send their condolences to the Russian people, and Kirby said that we condemn terrorism. And then a reporter asked Kirby, is this connected to the March 7th, March 8th announcement? And Kirby said, I'm going to consult with the State Department. This is what he said. I'm going to consult with the State Department, but I don't think the message from March 7th or 8th is connected to this attack. That's what Kirby said. It's on video. That's what he said. As Alexander pointed out the other day in the live stream, the March 7th, March 8th posting from the State Department, it was a 48-hour warning. 48 hours. It wasn't a 1-month warning. There wasn't another warning posted on March 22nd, 23rd, 24th. There was nothing like that. It was a 48-hour warning. And I mentioned this in a video about a week, like 4 or 5 days ago. I was on Twitter, and I saw a couple of accounts from people in Moscow who were saying that on that day, March 9th or 10th, there was a shaman concert, perhaps the biggest pop rock star in Russia today, and he was playing at that same exact venue. And a lot of people were posting on Twitter that they went to that concert, and the security was very tight. And the speculation, it's just speculation. The speculation is that perhaps that's what they were targeting. Perhaps the 48-hour warning was covering that time window. And because the security was so tight, things had to get pushed back to the next event, which was the picnic concert on the 23rd of 2022 or 23rd of March. But this article from the New York Times is now saying, hey, because we have the conflict in Ukraine, we don't want to share all our intelligence with Russia. We were afraid that they might find out our sources or our methods, and because we have the conflict, we don't want to share intelligence about a terrorist attack that's going to kill civilians. Really? Really, United States of America? Really, Biden White House? Is that what you're going to go with? And it works both ways now, because what are the Russians going to do? If the Russians have intelligence about something that's going to happen, are they going to come up with the same excuse because of the conflict in Ukraine? We don't want to share information with Europe or the United States. This was a terrible article from the New York Times, in my opinion. But they're trying to cover their tracks.
Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly, of course, the Russians know what warning they were given. So I suspect that somebody in Washington is worried that the Russians will go public with the wording, whatever wording it was, of the private warning. And so they want to get ahead of the story and explain in advance why the warning that was given in private was not particularly detailed. And I think that we've got to take it from this New York Times article that it wasn't particularly detailed, because what else is it saying ultimately?
Yeah, I think the United States, of course, the Biden administration at the lead, I mean, looks really bad in this situation. I think that's why we've seen this event be covered very differently than maybe other terrorist attacks in the past worldwide. I mean, it hasn't been covered in the same kind of tone in the United States, in the West, as usually when these things happen, especially in the West, there's a lot more of a somber tone. There's more talk about this. Some have even mentioned, especially all over Telegram, that the West is almost playing into this narrative that it was an inside job. There's some who have done that. I know Zelensky's regime has kind of made mention of this. I mean, given what we know about this conflict, though, between the United States, NATO, and Russia, what do you make of the comments from Alexander Bortnikov of the FSB chief? Russia has been, Putin in his address to the nation, Bortnikov, others have kind of said, we believe Ukraine is behind this, or at least involved in it. I don't think they said behind, but involved. The US, we believe they're involved. The UK, we believe they're involved. And this has angered the United States to the point where nearly every headline says that Russia is working hard to blame Ukraine, to pin it on anyone but ISIS. What do you make of these developments relating to this attack?
I think I'd like to just explain a few things. So Bortnikov is the head of the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service. It is Russia's counterintelligence, counter-terrorist agency, and it is also in control of the border. But as I understand it, they are not the primary investigative agency that's leading the investigation here. The investigative agency is a completely different body called the Investigative Committee, which is headed by somebody called Bastrikhin, and it is a police agency. So it is carrying out a criminal probe. The FSB obviously have some intelligence because they are an intelligence and a counterintelligence agency. But it's to Bastrikhin and the investigative committee, perhaps, that we should look to for actual information about what the investigation itself is telling us. But going back to Bortnikov, what Bortnikov basically said is this, and his words have not been, I think, fully understood. He said, there are indications, we have information. He actually said that. We have concrete information that Ukraine was involved in some way. He didn't tell us what that information was. And then he went on to say that because Ukraine is so heavily backed by the Western powers, the United States and Britain in particular. They are, since it looks as if Ukraine was involved, that means that the United States and Britain are ultimately responsible for it. He wasn't alleging that the British and the Americans actually sat down and planned this thing, but that's the connection that he was making. And I think that's going to be one that if there is a Ukrainian connection, or if the Russians say there is a Ukrainian connection, other Russians will be making even further. The more interesting thing, the most interesting point about Bortnikov's statement is that he said that the Russians have already got information which links Ukraine or someone in Ukraine to this attack. Now, we don't know what that might mean. It might be the mere fact that these people were heading towards the border, but we've just had this information about cryptocurrencies, for example, and that's more the kind of information that you would expect the FSB to find, because as an intelligence agency, they probably have ways of identifying movements in cryptocurrencies, which perhaps the investigative committee, which is leading the investigation, doesn't have. And that might be what Bortnikov was referring to.
Yeah, if the Biden White House or the MI6, the UK has any brains whatsoever, they would be on the phone with Zelensky and telling him, you've got to throw someone under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever did this, you've got to turn them over. We can't cover for you guys. I mean, that would that would be the smart thing for them to do, because the Russians, they're obviously they're going to find the Ukraine link. If a Ukraine link exists or it doesn't, they're going to find the Ukraine link. And the damning evidence for me is, and I don't think this is disputed, is that the car was making its way to Ukraine. So, Alexander pointed out, this is a very heavily guarded border. It's not the easiest border to cross. It's a war zone. So there must have been some entity that was going to move these guys over the border, I imagine. They could have gone in so many other directions. The smart thing for them to do would have been to just stay put in Moscow, I would guess. But they're making their way to Ukraine. I don't think that's being disputed. And the Russians are gonna find a Ukraine connection. That they're telling us they're going to find a Ukraine connection. So, the fact that the FSB is coming out and saying, well, if there's a Ukraine connection, well, there must be then a UK or a US connection. Well, of course, because you have a Washington Post story which came out 6 months ago, which talked about the CIA's ties to the SBU and how they were involved in the assassination of Daria Dugina, and they were pleading with the intel agencies in Ukraine to not go after Russian civilians, to not conduct operations inside of Russia. You had a New York Times article which came out last month, which talked about 12 CIA bunkers right on the border with Russia, and how the intel agencies have been trained by the U.S. intel agencies. You have these German commanders talking about how the UK, they're the ones that are operating the Storm Shadow missiles. Well, they've been talking about their involvement in Ukraine for the past 2 years, and now what do they expect the FSB to say? That there's no communication with the collective West in this instance? Of course not. Of course they're not going to say that. And of course, the Russian people are going to expect the FSB and the Russian government to say, well, behind these guys, there must be some collective West connection. It's they did this to themselves. They need to, if there are any brains in the collective West, they need to dump this Project Ukraine right away, because this is bringing the collective West down. We've said this for 2 years. This whole Project Ukraine is bringing the collective West down. But they can't disassociate. They can't stop.
No, and let's say they find the Ukraine connection and the evidence is released in whatever form Russia decides to release it to the public. I mean, how will this influence the conflict? How will it change anything about what happens from here on out? Maybe Alexander, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean,
take
it
that
will. I
first.
mean, the first thing to say is that, of course, if they do find a Ukrainian connection, it'll be important to know what that connection is. I mean, does it involve the Ukrainian authorities? Because, as I understand it, they're talking about Ukrainian nationalists that might not be government people, but if it is, if the Ukrainian government was involved, um, aiding and abetting in an act like this in Moscow is an act of war, legally speaking. And the Russians could upgrade the special military operation higher if they chose to, either perhaps to a counterterrorism operation. I mean, that might be one option. Or they could go even further and they could do what Peskov, Putin's spokesman, hinted at a few days ago, which is that they could go all the way up and say that this is a war. This is a simple, straightforward war, legally speaking. And in that case, various things that they haven't been doing up to this point, they might start to do, like blowing up bridges across the Dnieper, attacking power stations, going after the political leaders of Ukraine, doing all sorts of things that they haven't up to this point done. We'll just have to wait and see. And Putin is nothing if not an extremely careful man, and he always consults widely, and he'll probably consult with other world leaders as well and see what they have to say. But potentially, this is very big.
I would also add that diplomatically, they've lost the narrative now. Information-wise, media-wise, and diplomatically, they've lost the narrative, because if there was any doubt from any countries in the global majority, in the global South, about whether this war was a provocation or if Russia had any type of justification to wage this conflict in Ukraine, or if this was some sort of NATO proxy war with Russia, if they manage to establish a connection in Ukraine, well, then Russia, this goes from an unprovoked conflict to a provoked conflict. And the global majority is just going to rally further behind Russia. They're going to say, well, yeah, you guys were provoked. And not only were you provoked, but you have these nationalists now. And this plays right into Putin's denazification, where Putin now can come out and say, well, you see, I was telling you guys way at the beginning, we need to denazify Ukraine. And now look, we have these nationalists. If there is indeed a nationalist connection, we have these nationalists that will never leave us alone. We'll never be safe unless we get rid of these guys. This is gonna play perfectly into Russia's narrative, if this is indeed the case, and this was nationalists that were behind this terrorist attack.
And we'll have to see what that means, and we'll have to see what the investigative committee, because it's the investigative committee that's telling this, and is talking about these cryptocurrency transfers. But as I said, they've obviously had this from the FSB. We need to find out what we need to see where exactly this leads to. But if the Russians could put names to this, names of people in Ukraine who were responsible for transferring the funds, which they say played a role in making this attack possible, and they prove that kind of link, or at least they prove that kind of link to the satisfaction of most people in Russia and around the world, then of course the Russians can say that these people should be handed over to them. And then it becomes all very interesting and rather concerning, because Ukraine is probably not going to be willing to hand over those people. And then there have been instances in the past when countries that have been the target of terrorist attacks give ultimatums to countries that they say, are protecting those who were involved with the terrorists. And well, that can lead to all sorts of extraordinary consequences. As an example, Let's go back all the way to 2001. The United States and its allies gave a ultimatum to Afghanistan, to the then Taliban government there, and said, you must hand over Osama bin Laden, and if you don't, we're at war with you. So, there are precedents for taking this a lot further than the Russians have done up to this point.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to wait and see what comes out, but maybe we can transition, this attack on Moscow. It came after a series of events. You mentioned Alexander Dmitry Peskov and Russia's administration talking about how they're in a state of war. And I think you said in the program, that's since been clarified to not a legal kind of declaration of war, but a description of the overall situation, how it actually looks given NATO's involvement in Ukraine. And also it comes as, we had since the last time we spoke, we had the German Air Force leaks. We've had Macron over and over and over and over and over again. It seems like talk about sending troops to Ukraine from NATO. I think there are reports now that NATO's so-called front line, or the former Soviet republics, Latvia, Estonia, etc., are preparing for war, although that has been they've been part of NATO military exercises directed at Russia for quite many years since their admission. But there's also this interesting piece I was mentioning before the program. I just want to pull it up really quick and get your reaction to it. It's in the Times of London by Ian, I believe that's how you say his name. Maybe I'm pronouncing completely wrong. It's time we talked about the fall of Kiev. And in it, he's talking about how in July, so it's like a scenario, it's July and the Russian army is at the gates of Kiev. So that's not so far from now. That's only a few months. This was written literally in the hours before we spoke. He's not going to leave. He needs ammunition. And so he basically laments on the fact that this is the scenario that the West, Washington, Paris, and Brussels are kind of mapping out and almost expecting, that it's not a frozen conflict where there's no decisive advantage at all, that actually there is a collapse coming. And so I'm curious, because I've seen this in The Economist as well, this description of the situation in regards to the weapons and the ammunition, all of this not going to Ukraine as fast or as much as it's needed, leading to a push by Russia this summer to essentially continue to make advances after the fall of Avdiivka. Maybe if we can get it like a battlefield update in the context of some of these political alarm bells being sounded, as well as maybe some of these desperate moves from some of these NATO member states themselves.
Well, the desperate moves are the product of what is happening on the battlefields, and this is I think the key thing to understand. I mean, this time last year, lots of optimism. The Ukrainians were going to launch their big offensive in the summer of 2023. It was widely expected that even if the Russians were completely defeated, they would nonetheless be defeated to at least some degree. The Russians were supposed to be on the back foot, and it was supposed and hoped that by this time this year, the West would be dictating terms. What has happened is something completely different. The Ukrainian offensive failed utterly. In fact, and this is something I insist on saying, the Russians defeated it. There is this unwillingness to accept the fact that the offensive didn't just fail of itself. It was actually defeated. The Russians stopped it. They stopped it in its tracks. The Ukrainians suffered enormous losses. The equipment that the West supplied to Ukraine was burnt up. And after that happened, they were all comforting themselves. They were saying, well, look, there's going to be a stalemate now. Except there hasn't been a stalemate. And at some point over the last couple of weeks, probably at some point in January, finally the realization dawned that the Russians are going to win this war, that they are outproducing the West in artillery shells, in drones, in tanks, in every conceivable weapon system that's operating over Ukraine, that the F-16s are not going to make any difference on the battlefronts, and they're going to arrive too late, and they're going to be too few, and the Russians will shoot them down. It's also the realization that the air defense missiles that Ukraine has are running out, and that there aren't air defense missiles to replace them. And as I said, suddenly, sometime in January, the penny dropped. And I think what then crystallized matters further and made people realize this is going to happen a lot sooner than we feared, than we thought it would, was that Avdiivka, the most heavily fortified position that the Ukrainians had on the entire front line, collapsed in the middle of February. So since then, you've had several weeks of people thrashing around looking for things to do, sending tourist missiles to Ukraine. These are from Germany, launching deep strikes on the Kerch Bridge, deep inside Russia. That's going to scare Putin. That's going to force the Russians to come to terms. Others coming up with even more desperate plans, like Macron talking about sending French troops to Ukraine to fight the Russians. And I think what has then happened beyond that is that over the last 2 weeks or so, there's suddenly been an understanding in the West also that none of this is going to work. Tourist missiles are not going to change anything. The F-16s are going to fail. Sending troops to Ukraine would be a disaster. The Russians would destroy them, and European publics would not accept it. And the United States is not prepared to go to World War III on behalf of Ukraine. So suddenly we have this widespread understanding right across Europe and indeed the United States as well, that Ukraine is going down and there is nothing that can be done to turn the situation round. And you're starting to get people like Ian Martin talking about these scenarios, that Kiev is going to fall in July. There's a blame game out, blame the Republicans because they haven't authorized the $61 billion package. There's been articles about this in the Financial Times talking about the betrayal of Ukraine, things of that kind. So there's recriminations, there's attempts to shift the blame around. But none of this changes the fact that the West suddenly understands that all the things they hoped would happen, Russia collapsing economically, Russia being defeated on the battlefield, the Ukrainians fighting the Russians to a stalemate, none of this is going to happen. The Russian economy continues to grow. It continues to outproduce the West in weapons. The Russian army is getting bigger. It's continuing to advance. And everybody is spooked and panicked. They don't know what to do.
Yeah. Zelensky was in Sumy checking the fortifications out, taking a look at Ukraine's Sudovikin line, and it doesn't look very, very impressive. And it looks like Russia's going to, if they want to, they're going to move right through those fortifications. And you can tell from the look on Zelensky's face that he is defeated. He is absolutely defeated. But the whole fall of Kiev, I suggest that everyone goes to the live stream that we did with Jacques Bad, and he explains exactly what the Russian strategy is. And we've been talking about the Russian strategy as well for a long time. Since the beginning of the conflict, we talked about Clausewitz and how the Russians are going to fight this war. And it still seems that the collective West is stuck on territory. They still believe that Russia is concerned about territory. And during that live stream, we talked about how Russia will take territory if they believe that it is going to help them in their overall objective, in their overall strategy. They will take territory. If it's not going to help them to get to their overall objective, then they're not going to take territory. It's that simple. But the West is stuck on territorial gain. They're stuck on these movie type of scenarios: the fall of Kiev, the siege of Kiev, the Kherson counteroffensive. To this day, they still have not understood the way Russia is going about this conflict.
Absolutely.
And,
Just to quickly
yeah.
say, I mean, they think about Kiev, like it's going to be the fall of Berlin or the fall of Saigon
Yeah.
or something like that. Whereas that's not what the Russians are up to. They are working towards destroying the Ukrainian army. That is their objective and has been from day one. And they've been doing that systematically right from the first day. And they're getting close now to the point where that situation has come, with Ukraine running out of men, running out of ammunition, running out of machines to fight with, weapons to fight with. And it's likely that this process, once spring, summer begins, is going to accelerate.
Yeah, it's demilitarization, Alexander. Demilitarization.
Yeah.
When Putin said that at the beginning of the SMO, everyone in the West was laughing. What's demilitarization?
Oh no, definitely.
What's he
Yeah.
talking about? Right?
Absolutely not.
And they constructed the siege of Kiev narrative. They constructed it.
Mm.
Not Putin did not say in the opening statement, our goal is to take Kiev in 3 days, or our goal is to take Odessa, or our goal is to go to Lviv. He never said any of those things. Actually, in 2 years, they've never said that their goal is to get to this point. Medvedev, he's hinted at things, but I think that's
Right.
Medvedev's bad cop type of role to keep everyone guessing. But officially, Russia has never stated that they're going to get to this point or that point. All this Kiev stuff was this is the West. This is their narratives. Putin said demilitarization, and he meant it. Demilitarization. I think the surprise is that no one thought that when Putin said demilitarization, that he actually meant demilitarization of many countries in Europe and in the West as well. I think
Right.
that's the
NATO,
surprising
basically.
part.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about this too is that this whole siege of Kiev narrative feeds into what Vladimir Putin has recently objected to, and what I think Russia has objected to from the very beginning. This kind of concocted Cold War-ish Russian expansionist project that is constantly projected upon Russia. We've heard Lloyd Austin say it to the highest echelons of the United States Biden White House. We've had, European leader after European leader say this. Well, if Kiev falls, if Ukraine falls, then Putin won't stop there. Russia will continue to expand throughout Europe. How much of that, though, is not just projection, but almost like a prediction almost of a broader conflict with NATO? Because as I mentioned earlier, and you referenced, Alexander, Emmanuel Macron can't stop talking about sending French troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. How much of this is like a prediction of a future that, whether they want it or not, or maybe both, they're kind of expecting at some point in the future? And Ukraine seemed to be a lot about this, building up to this bigger conflict.
Well, you make two very important points, and you're absolutely right about both of them. The first is, as somebody who studied European history, I can say definitely this narrative that the Russians are out to conquer the whole of Europe has been there since the early 18th century, since the time of Peter the Great. That this vast military empire in the east is, that the Cossacks are, intending to march westwards all the way to the Rhine or the Seine, or the English Channel, or whatever it is. And, this narrative of the Russians as being expansionist and aggressive, it dominated the whole of the 19th century. I mean, in Western, especially British, but also to a great extent French political discourse, the Russians were always going to advance all the way to the West, and this was their plan. And of course, it dominated much of the 20th century as well. It is interspersed with the other narrative that you also get about Russia, which is the diametric opposite about Russia, that it's weak, that it's about to fall apart, that it's in decline. So either it's the one or it's the other, we never have any real shade in between. We never talk about the country as a normal country. Now, the Russians have never shown any desire to advance westwards. I mean, they're a huge country itself. They're very, very familiar with their resources. You mentioned Putin. Putin yesterday spoke all about this. He compared the military spending in the West with the military spending in Russia. He pointed out the United States spends 10 times more on defense matters than Russia does. Then that doesn't even include the rest of NATO. The idea of the Russians trying to conquer Europe, as he said, is ridiculous. It is absurd. But of course, people are saying that. And you are absolutely right in your second point. Keeping up this narrative has a tendency to be a danger, runs the danger that it might become self-fulfilling. The two times in modern European history when the Russians did advance, to the Elbe, and then before that to the Seine, was after they themselves were invaded. Napoleon invaded Russia, got all the way to Moscow. The Russians drove him out, and in the war that followed, reached Paris. Hitler did the same. He invaded Russia. He almost got to Moscow, and the Russians, of course, drove him out and then got all the way to Berlin. So I'm not saying that's how it's going to turn out this time. I don't think it will, actually. But the one way, the most likely way, the only way you could persuade the Russians to move west is if you attack them. And it's very alarming and very strange, given the history and the record of what happens when you do, that there are some people in the West who talk as if that's what we should do.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, Macron tried. He's still trying, I guess, to provoke Russia by floating the idea of sending the French troops into Ukraine. But Putin the other day, when he was at the Tver region, he actually said the same thing, that Russia has no intention of going to Europe. He said it's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. But Putin also said that that the Europeans they need to continue to say that Russia's going to invade, because at the end of the day, it's all about Europe creating this type of Russia boogie bank, so they can centralize more power. That's what this is all about. Is the European Union, Brussels, centralizing more power. That's what all of this, Russia's going to invade us, and to keep people afraid, keep the European people afraid. Spent a lot of money on the military, on the MIC. Got to get the money to the MIC. Got to create factories. Got to get those MIC stocks pumping up. And then, as we have said in many videos, it's war bonds, it's Euro bonds, it's direct taxation, it's EU armies. And that EU army is not going to be pointed outwards. That EU army is going to be pointed inwards into the European Union. That EU army is going to be created, and they want to create that EU army. Macron is going crazy trying to create this EU army, because they want that EU army to control the EU citizens, so that next time the farmers want to protest, they can send the EU army to stop the farmers from protest. That's what all of this is about. But they need that enemy. They need that boogeyman, and there's no one better than Putin and Russia. It's perfect for them.
Yeah, not a dissimilar dynamic, certainly in the United States, where rampant military spending generally also ends up in the hands of the national security state as well, to do exactly what you just said, Alex, the same purposes. So maybe to kick it back to you, Alexander, just briefly to close on this topic of NATO and the battlefield in Ukraine. Since this siege narrative is so ridiculous, and July is not so far off, what can we really expect then from Russia from here on out? I know the results of the investigation might play into this, but let's say if we control for that, then what is the next steps for Russia on the battlefield, given where they are situated right now?
This is an excellent question, but it's always a very difficult one to answer because, of course, the Russian general staff who are running the war are a very secretive organization, and they don't share their plans with us. Now, there are strong indications that the Russians, they've been talking about a buffer zone in to guard their northern borders. The Ukrainians have been undertaking incursions or trying to undertake incursions into Russia proper through attacks on Kursk and Belgorod regions. And they continue to shell Russian cities, like Belgorod specifically. So the Russians have been talking about setting up a buffer zone. And over the last week or so, the Russians have been conducting a bombing offensive around the city of Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine on a scale like nothing I have seen. I mean, in fact, the bombing and the missile strikes that the Russians are conducting across Ukraine at the moment is also on a scale like nothing I have seen. But the bombing of Kharkiv is particularly intense. We're talking almost at American levels of bombing. And it appears that they're directed principally at military units, but they've also destroyed power stations around Kharkiv, which will make it more difficult to move to send troops there because troops in this war are transferred by train, and the trains in this part of the world work on electric traction. So that perhaps points to an offensive towards Kharkiv, maybe in May or June, when the ground hardens, and that the preparations are being made to do that. So that's one possibility. But the other area where the Russians have been fighting and where they've been achieving the big results over the last couple of weeks is somewhere completely different. And this, I think, might be, in fact, the more important battlefield, and that is central Donbass. Now, this is where the Ukrainians created their major fortified lines, where there were places like Avdiivka, Marinka, these are small towns, Bakhmut, which you remember from last year, Pervomaisky, Krasnogorovka. There's even a town there, by the way, a small town, which incredibly goes by the name of New York. Just saying, it is actually called that. The actual name of it is New York. Strange. But anyway, these are all fortified towns. And what the Russians are doing is that they're capturing them one by one. And the process appears to be accelerating, because if you take the one, that opens the way to capturing the other. The number of these fortified towns is shrinking. The landscape is opening up. So I think that the major Russian attack, if it comes this summer, what the major Russian objective is this summer, is to take these remaining fortified towns in central Donbass. And once they do that, potentially they can advance eastwards towards the Dnieper River, and they can start to threaten traffic along the Dnieper River and the two big cities on the Dnieper, which are Zaporozhye and Dnipro, which is a little to the north of Zaporozhye. And frankly, if they do that, if they reach the Dnieper opposite these two cities, and if they capture them, and if Zaporozhye is on the east bank of the Dnieper, then I think they've won the war. Because I don't think they just won the war. I think the war at that point will be in the end game, because the universal consensus, even within Ukraine, is that Ukraine cannot continue the war without those two cities. They are two of the most important industrial cities in Ukraine. They control access to the Dnieper. They are the major staging grounds for the Ukrainian army. If the Ukrainians lose them, then it's game over.
Yeah. Don't be surprised if we don't see a Zelensky collapse.
No.
You know, a lot of people are being fired, or leaving, or jumping ship. A lot of ambassadors in London, ambassador in Norway now with Danilov. I mean, it does feel like a lot of these people, to me, I don't think they're being fired, or they're definitely not being fired. If I had to take a guess, I would think that a guy like Danilov and these guys are going to Zelensky and they're saying, "Look, I want out.
Yeah.
I want out. I've made all this cash. I need to get off this ship. So give me a post as ambassador." So I don't know. I'm seeing things as a lot of people are looking to bolt, and there have been reports that a lot of parliament members in the Rada are also trying to find a way to get out.
Yes.
So something like that could happen as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just throwing it out there.
Yes.
Well, you were reading my mind, actually, Alex, because that was going to be the next topic about the difference. When we talk about winning a war, right? There's military, and then there's the political side of war. And I wanted to talk about the differences in, given the recent election in Russia, the differences in Russia's political leadership and where Ukraine is at and what that's a reflection of. But Alexander, I'll let you comment first.
Can I throw a question to you, Alexander, real quick on the note that Danny just made? If there were to be a government collapse in Kiev, could the United States use that as a way to prevent a Russian advance? And would the international community say, "Okay, well, now we have the possibility of getting people in place who can negotiate a peace with Russia. So, all is good now." I mean, could that be something that could happen?
I have to say, I don't think so. I think if we see a government collapse, like we saw in Saigon, for example, which is what basically started to happen in the last few weeks of the war, then I think that the overwhelming sense, both in the West and around the world, will be that Ukraine is unraveling. And the view that will be taken then is we keep away. We stay away. We don't want to be drawn in and dragged down with Ukraine and with this sinking thing. And a collapse is perfectly possible. There could be protests. Military units might mutiny. There's already been lots of discontent in some of the military units. The new commander, General Sirski, appears to have cracked down on that, but it's not popular, and he's not popular. So it's not impossible that there could be a collapse, but I don't think it could be used by the US to stop the Russians. I think the Russians are more likely to say, look, if there's a collapse, a total collapse, then it's even more imperative that we move forward, because if we don't, then chaos will follow. And that was the kind of reasoning that you saw, by the way, also towards the end at the end in Vietnam, when the government in Saigon started to fall apart. It became increasingly clear that the only alternative, not the alternative, what was coming was the North Vietnamese. So just saying, I mean, this is my own personal view. If we go back to Danny's point, the key thing to understand about war from a Russian perspective is, well, it comes back to what Alex was saying about Clausewitz. The Russians do not make this great distinction that we make between politics and war. War for them is part of politics. And this is something, again, that we find very difficult to understand, because we come from a completely different political culture, especially Americans, I think, because Americans and British people are we have a civilian culture with a military attached to it. Whereas in Russia, it isn't like that. The two are much more involved with each other. So there's a seamless web from the one to the other. I think that from the Russian perspective, war is always a total thing. I mean, they don't make the distinction that we make between total war and non-total war either. If you find yourself in a war, every single resource that you have is focused upon achieving your objective. And that is, I think, very much how the Russians are thinking. And Putin's election reflects this. The size of his majority in the election reflects this also. When there is a conflict situation. Russian society tends to consolidate, and that's exactly what we're seeing. The event in Crocus City Hall is going to intensify that process even more. The economy is gearing up increasingly to providing the weapons to make sure that the war is won. We see thousands of people joining the army in that kind of situation. So this is the kind of way in which the Russians think. The Ukrainians don't think that way. They on the contrary, have a much more diffuse, decentralized political system. I suspect because ultimately Ukraine never fully matured as a state system. So you don't have a kind of strong state in the way that you do in Russia. And that is a factor that makes a collapse in Ukraine much more likely, whereas it makes a collapse in Russia all but impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reports that you mentioned, Alex, about MPs in the Servant of the People party, talking about, several of them, a major number of them saying that there's no point to even being an MP because the parliament is in effect a rubber stamp for whatever Zelensky wants to do. We don't even really have to work. We want to go. And Danilov, Alexei Danilov, he is gone after making some just horrific remark after remark. I mean, he is quite the character. Back last year, insulting the intelligence of Chinese, Indians, the Indians, like talking about Asians being less than human. He also mispronounced recently China's envoy, Li Hui, his name to symbolize a part of the body that in Russian and in Ukrainian is not very flattering. And then, of course, I think the most disgusting thing that he did right before he left was make light and make fun of. And some people were saying he revealed that Ukraine is definitely involved because he was talking about how fun everything was going in Moscow during the Crocus attack. But this is the kind of thing. You have Zelensky hiding in a bunker. You have guys like Danilov in major positions. And you have, Russia, on the other hand, you have Vladimir Putin, a stable leader who, after this attack, was talking about humanism, was talking about, ensuring the safety, especially of groups who may be targeted after this, like the Tajiks in Russia. Like, just a completely different, if you just look at it that way, you never have this in the Western mainstream media where there's an actual look at, well, how does this reflect on how things are actually going in this conflict when you have a society at war like Russia getting remarkably more stable, and then you have the other side that we have been told has either been winning or in a stalemate or in trouble but could win in 2025, looking the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think the other big narrative that's going to crumble is this whole Zelensky's this Churchill figure, and the Ukraine government's this democratic human rights Western values type of government. That thing's going to crumble. That's going to be really embarrassing when that narrative crumbles. But these guys were never statesmen. They were never professionals. I mean, Zelensky, at the end of the day, Zelensky and his entire staff were a bunch of TV producers. They were actors and TV producers, all of them, from Yermak to Zelensky to one time Arestovich. Arestovich is now gone, but they were never at the caliber of Putin and his team. And in Danilov, the thing that what he called the Chinese diplomat, it's a terrible word in Russian. I mean, like the worst word, one of the worst words in Russian. So, these guys, they're awful. They're absolutely awful. And with each passing day, they're getting worse. They're making demands of the West. Kuleba, the other day in Politico, is like, give us the damn Patriots. I mean, they're really getting belligerent. They're making demands. I predict that there's going to be a lot of people in the West who are going to get sick and tired of these guys. I'll put money on it. They're probably, when Zelensky calls them, I'm sure there's a bunch of people in the West who are like, my God, I don't want to talk to this guy. I don't want to talk to the people on his team. I'm tired of them. They're not helping their own cause at all. And Kuleba, he's the top diplomat in Ukraine, and the way he talks is anything but diplomatic. Compare him to Lavrov, you can't. So it's a train wreck. This whole thing is a train wreck. But when that narrative about Churchill, when that thing comes crashing down, look out.
I just want to add a few things, and this is something I wanted to discuss, and Alex can confirm it. I think a point which many people who are not Russians don't realize is that bad language in Russia carries an exceptionally strong charge. It's not something you do lightly. And if you do it in a public situation, if you do it in a formal setting as a statesperson, it is even more shocking to Russians. And by the way, Ukrainians, because the culture is so similar, it is far more shocking to them than it would be in the West. I mean, it is, I mean, people absolutely loathe it. I mean, they might, use strong language in private with each other, but even there, Westerners who go to Russia are always very strongly advised not to try to use strong language, to use strong Russian words, because it's a dangerous thing to do. So what Danilov did was just way out, even by Ukrainian and Russian standards. I mean, it was just, people in Ukraine would have been appalled. I can say that with confidence, and I think Alex would confirm this. So moving on from that, why are they talking in this way? Because they're getting desperate. I mean, they're becoming increasingly frightened, and they're getting desperate, and they're talking in this extreme language and making these extreme demands, and that's a reflection of it. And some of them, exactly as Alex says, are looking for ways out. They're looking for bolt holes to escape before everything falls apart. The fact that Danilov spoke in this way, the fact that Kuleba spoke in this way, the fact that by many accounts Kuleba turns up drunk to meetings is a sign that things are going very badly wrong. And as for Zelensky, we've discussed this many times in many programs. Outside the West, but to some extent now even in the West, when people encounter him, when world leaders encounter him, they don't like him. Prime Minister Modi of India didn't like him. President Lula of Brazil is absolutely furious with him and won't have any contact with him because Zelensky failed to turn up to a meeting that he was supposed to go to. MBS of Saudi Arabia was furious. And you could find many examples of this. Even some of the people in Congress in the United States, when they encountered Zelensky in person, were not impressed. So these are people who have been elevated to political positions that they're not remotely qualified for. And I'm afraid it's showing. And as things fall apart, it shows even more. I suspect the reason they're there, by the way, is because the people who put them there basically didn't want strong personalities. They wanted people that they could control. And that's, the oligarchs in Ukraine who pull the strings, the Western powers to some extent. And the result is that Ukraine, as I said previously, has never matured as a state and has never produced statesmen and stateswomen. It has never done that. And at a time of crisis, that increasingly shows.
Yeah, and it is quite remarkable when you have Danilov speak in this way to a Chinese envoy who is simply saying that Russia needs to be part of any kind of peace agreement. That became so offensive to someone like Alexei Danilov that he had to go. And there was in the video, which I won't play, but in the video, you see the host of the Ukrainian television like laughing because she knows what he said. That's how putrid this guy is. But I think you're exactly right, Alexander. This does show a level of desperation. And I noticed too that Zelensky is not at the forefront. He's not in the forefront anymore in the Western media, in the Western press. There isn't as much bragging about Zelensky's leadership and how incredible he is doing and what he's doing, his leadership. That all of that has left. That ship has well sailed. We don't really hear much about this chaos outside of very brief reports anymore. And I think that in of itself speaks volumes, given the opposite is true in Russia, and they can't even hide the truth in Russia. I read a Washington Post article. It was incredible. On the day of the election, on the eve of the election in Russia, there was supposedly Washington Post reporters in Belgorod, and they were talking to people there, and literally everyone that they spoke to said, we're going to vote for Putin harder because of these attacks that Ukraine and their forces and those they're sponsoring are conducting. We're going to vote for him harder. We support him even more. We support what Russia is doing even more because they're the ones protecting us. So I think it's astounding to see where things have gone, especially in relation to the tale of two political systems.
Well, indeed. I mean, if I can just come back again to Danilov, I mean, the very last thing that Ukraine ought to be doing at this time is antagonizing China. It's about the only country that might be able to actually help Ukraine in this situation. I mean, they have influence over the Russians. They have leverage. About the only people who do. And, if Xi Jinping picked up the telephone and called Putin, Putin would listen to what Xi Jinping says. So Xi Jinping and his envoy are people that a wise Ukrainian government should work very, very hard to keep happy. And at various times, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, who spoke to Xi Jinping about a year ago, we remember we discussed this actually on one of your shows, I think, Dan. Zelensky in the past has shown some understanding of it. So has Kuleba. And now, of course, here comes Danilov, and he behaves in this grotesque way. So that shows the unbalanced people that there are in Kiev and in power in Kiev. And as for the fact that people in Belgorod support Putin and people across Russia support Putin, well, in any country which finds itself at war, there is an instinct to consolidate around the government. That's by definition. Given what has happened and given Russian history, that instinct to consolidate in Russia is even greater. And what I have never understood is, do Western governments want Putin to remain indefinitely president of Russia? Because if they do, then they're going about it in exactly the right way. The sanctions, the abuse, the constant pressure, the meddling in Russian affairs, all of these, the conflict with Ukraine, all of that is all it's going to do is make Russians feel that they should support Putin even more because he's the leader of their country. Now, it should not be difficult to work that out.
Yeah, and there were rumors. I don't know if these are verified that the United States, there was a directive to circumvent and undermine the election in Russia to any degree that was possible. Of course, I think everything that was attempted. I think whatever Russian opposition exists in Russia is so weak. Especially we haven't even gotten to Navalny and his death and how that kind of reflects where the so-called opposition is. But anyway, continue.
Well, I mean, we haven't, but perhaps we should, because I mean, look, I mean, when you start saying that queues of people going to vote is a sign of protest, then you are really desperate. I mean, that's what it came to. I mean, I have to say, when I read that, and by the way, every single newspaper in Britain was running with this story, which is astonishing. I was thinking to myself, what planet are these people on? I mean, it really was one of the most bizarre things I have ever seen.
Yeah. The election interference, I think, it was that Navalny, the Navalny story. That was their election play, and that's probably all they could do when you think about it. I mean, they weren't able to do anything else as far as trying to prevent Putin from winning. I mean, that they understood that. So I guess Yolanda Navalny, that was their election strategy. You got to just going back to the stuff that Danilov says and the stuff that the Ukraine leadership says, the stupid stuff, the reckless stuff that they say. Maybe we shouldn't be so hard on them, actually, because if their example are the leaders of the collective West. That's who they're looking at, and the leaders of the collective West, they're going around saying Xi Jinping's a dictator. When Biden just met Xi Jinping, 24 hours later, he's calling him a dictator. Yesterday, Biden called Putin a butcher. A month ago, he called him an SOB. Right. The European leaders aren't saying anything nicer about Putin or anybody else. That's not part of the EU family. So, I guess, I don't know, maybe in a weird way, the leaders in Kiev are saying, well, if Biden and Annalena and Olaf Trudeau, if they can say nasty stuff about the Chinese or the Russians or the Indians, well, so can we. They're probably looking at the leaders in the West, and they want to be like them. So I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, and maybe lastly, and we can also get to a few questions in this last segment as well from the audience. But I wanted to talk about something you mentioned, Alexander, in passing, about the if NATO, if the United States wanted Vladimir Putin to be president of Russia for as long as possible, they're doing everything correct. And I think this also goes for, this emerging multipolar world that Russia is, in all intents and purposes, one of the principal leaders of. It's going to host the next BRICS summit in Kazan, I believe it is, this coming October. And I was thinking about, as you both were speaking about the political collapse that's happened in Ukraine and how it is, and as you said, it's a reflection of the United States and where United States and Europe is at. There is this very curious phenomenon of, the more that NATO pushes, the more that the United States pushes, the stronger this alternative pole becomes, the stronger that Russia becomes, the stronger that China becomes in leading this. I was just even thinking about how I couldn't even imagine Vladimir Zelensky having any kind of interaction with, forget Vladimir Putin, but even Xi Jinping. That's why it's so ridiculous to attack China. Not Ukraine has pushed China so far away, and the same could go for what Israel is doing right now. They're pushing what was at least stable economic partners completely away, in regards to China and in a large degree Russia as well. So it seems like the more that the United States kind of extends and overstretches its hand with regard to this 21st century empire it's trying to maintain, the stronger that Russia and China are becoming. And it's playing out in it seems to be very problematic ways, diplomatically and politically, for not just Ukraine, but really the entire collective West. It's becoming more and more isolated as we speak. But Alexander, if you want to start.
No, this is absolutely correct. I mean, if you look at the financial system. Now, we did a live stream yesterday with David Sachs, and he made the point that the reason the United States can run astronomical budget deficits and can pile on debt at the level of $1 trillion every 100 days is because it has the world's reserve currency. So what does the Biden administration currently do? It undermines, it does everything it possibly can to persuade people around the world that it is dangerous for the United States to have the world's reserve currency, because it abuses the power that gives it, not just in terms of its own budget, but it tries to use its currency to undermine other countries. So the Chinese, some time ago, 10 years ago already, were talking about the need to equalize trade systems, and they were starting to float the idea of an alternative financial architecture, not based on the dollar. Very few people were interested in that at that time, because the dollar seemed to be stable. It served its function. Nobody had any great incentive to change that. Now, the United States has given everybody around the world every reason to move away from the dollar. And lo and behold, the major topic of discussion at Kazan, apparently, is going to be moving forward with the new global financial and trading architecture that the BRIC states, first and foremost China, because that's the key one. They're the people who have to bankroll this and who have to design it. Anyway, that's what they're now going to be talking about when they meet in Kazan. The United States has brought that about. It's made possible what the Chinese wanted, but which had been impossible before. And we see this out all the time. We see this at the UN, where more and more countries are now siding with the BRIC states because they see what's happened here in the Middle East and they don't like what the US is doing. We see this in the international trade system, where all the sanctions that the US is imposing are now actually acting as a major obstruction to world trade. So that, if you're a ship owner and you want to send your ship to Karachi to load goods there, you don't know whether the port is sanctioned or the person who's going to be supplying the goods is sanctioned, or whether somebody who that person has contact with, further down the line is sanctioned, so that if you go ahead and take those goods, you might be sanctioned yourself. It's chaos. It's absolute chaos, when what the United States above all needs is an orderly, predictable system. And it comes down to this pointless, extreme belligerence which the Biden administration has brought to the conduct of policy. It seeks always confrontation with all its enemies, picking quarrels with its enemies, the people rather it labels as its enemies, both domestically and abroad. The Chinese weren't looking to become enemies. Xi Jinping told Biden at their last meeting, we don't aim to supersede you. That's not what we're about. We want just to be able to trade. We want to get on with you, not to replace you. But the administration doesn't seem to understand that. And exactly as you say, what it is doing as a result is it's making the adversary stronger, and it's turning the adversary or the competitor into an enemy. It's one of the most catastrophic failures of statesmanship that I can ever think of.
Oh, you're muted, Alex.
And they were warned many times. Going back to the SWIFT, I remember the whole SWIFT incident. Even the Fed, they warned Biden, don't go down this route. But Biden ignored all of them. The Biden White House ignored everybody.
Yeah. And it's quite pathetic also to see the Biden administration, the United States, when it comes to China. But I think this goes for the entire geopolitical landscape. But if we just look at China, they'll say, well, China's the one that is not being cooperative. China's the one that won't be fair economically, when the United States has done nothing to present a kind of friendly economic, political, or otherwise environment from which China would, give way to any kind of U.S. request or demand or anything of the sort. So it's so interesting that that always happens, and the same goes for Russia, and even right now, what's happening in the Middle East and West Asia. The United States is blowing up. I know you two both talked about the recent ceasefire resolution just passed, put out by Algeria, and the United States is not making any friends, even regionally. I mean, they lost the Abraham Accords; those are kablooey. Those are gone, and everything it has done in relation to this war, led by Israel, has I think damaged the U.S.'s reputation dramatically, and has led to things like Russia and China taking a much more assertive role in that region too, even before this October 7th plus conflict began.
Well, this is absolutely correct. I mean, China is now a major player in the Middle East. When has that ever been true before? When in history has China been a major player in the Middle East? It is now. It is now. And why is it a major player in the Middle East? Because the country that has dominated Middle East affairs, which is the United States, has so completely mishandled them. And it did so again at the Security Council just a few days ago, because they abstained on a resolution, a ceasefire resolution, which, to be clear, they never wanted. But anyway, they decided that they would abstain. And then, having gained whatever goodwill that might have accrued to them from that, the fact that they didn't veto that resolution, they then promptly throw that goodwill away by saying, oh, well, this resolution, which we've allowed the Security Council to pass, it doesn't mean anything because it's not binding, which, of course, is going to annoy all the people in the Middle East who have been lobbying for the resolution, including the Algerians, the other Arab states, the Muslim countries, all of them. So, it's stupid. I mean, what exactly are they trying to achieve by behaving that way? That they've annoyed the Israelis and Israel's friends by letting the resolution pass, but they've not gained anything geopolitically or diplomatically, because they then turn around and say, well, this resolution, actually, we're not going to pay any attention to it. I mean, this is not the way in which diplomacy at this level ought to be conducted. I mean, that's ought to be obvious, but apparently it isn't. And the result is that more and more countries in the Middle East are saying to themselves, we don't look to the United States, because the United States never finds solutions. It only creates problems. It doesn't solve divisions. It exacerbates them. It doesn't bring peace. It promotes war. So let's look to the Chinese instead, who have far superior statecraft. And you saw last year, Saudi Arabia and Iran, they went to China, and it was China that brokered the reconciliation between them. And now Wang Yi tours the Middle East. He talks to all the various top leaders there. He's on excellent terms with the Saudis. He's on excellent terms with the Iranians. He's on excellent terms with all the various parties in the Middle East. He even manages to talk to the Israelis from time to time, by the way, just saying. And people look to him. And it's, again, the Biden administration that has done that. And, we focused on the Middle East, but they're doing it in area after area. You talked about China. Americans are entitled, if they wish, to have, feelings of grievance that the Chinese maybe, push the envelope a bit in trading relationships. The Chinese, as I've experienced myself, deeply practical people. They probably understand that. You can sort out a trade deal. No, you sanction them instead. You go around sanctioning Chinese officials. You go sanctioning Chinese companies. You try to stop China from developing 5G and AI technologies. You try to block China's entire economic development. I mean, that isn't rectifying unfair trade. That is geopolitical oppression against China, which is not going to work. Again, all that it is doing is it's making the Chinese see the United States as an enemy, not perhaps as a trade rival, where it could have been kept it.
Yeah. And then the UK starts sanctioning China.
Oh yeah, Cameron was out right recently talking about cyber sanctions.
Yeah,
yeah.
There was a time.
Go on.
There was a time when there were leaders in Europe and leaders in the UK who would not go along with everything the US did. Actually, they acted as a balance at times for when the US wanted to do stuff that was not in the West or even in the US's interests. There were leaders in Europe that would tell the United States and call the United States out. They would say, let's not go down this path. There was a time when that was a reality. Now they follow the Biden White House on all of the Biden White House is terrible policies. They're following the Biden White House. When you take a step back and think about it, it's crazy. This is the team that you guys are doing the bidding for. It's hard to explain, but
well, it is. Can I just say something about Britain and China? Because two things to say. Firstly, Cameron himself, when he was prime minister, promoted good relations with China because he thought that this was going to be the way that Britain, which has severe economic problems, structural economic problems, that this was the way it was going to pull through. It was going to be by developing trade and business relations with China. He talked about a golden age in relations between China and Britain. And now, of course, he's trashed it. He himself, having said all of that, because the Biden administration tells him to, he's trashed it. Now, the British ought to be particularly careful about their relations with China, because as we know from Chinese history, relations between China and Britain have not always been easy, to put it mildly. I mean, there are, little topics like the Opium Wars and the burning of the Summer Palace in Beijing, and, the looting of the various buildings there, and the establishment of all the concessions in Shanghai and elsewhere, and Hong Kong. You would have thought, again, that in relations with China, Britain would tread very carefully, given that so many countries around the world clearly now see China as the rising power, and given that it is the manufacturing colossus, which even David Cameron himself once understood it was in British interests to make friends with.
Yeah, and even this approach by both the United States and the UK, I mean, the consequences are there. You can slap incredibly discriminatory tariffs onto China's car industry, its electric vehicle industry. And you had recently actually BYD, the Chinese producer of electric vehicles, which is by far the biggest, and now the biggest in the world. And China is the biggest car manufacturer in the world right now. And the United States can't get access to that market. Chinese cars won't be sold in the United States, and it won't benefit anybody because, well, they would be so astronomically priced that no one would be able to buy them. So the United States literally shuts off itself. It doesn't produce any competitive alternative, but is willing to also shut off the primary competitor. And that's, I think, so interesting. It has had such ripple effects to the point where a lot of the sanctioned industries that related to both China and Russia now have brought both these two countries together and allowed them to work out their very congruent and complementary economies together. And now we're seeing the results of it. These two countries are rising together and working much closer than they ever have.
Well, absolutely. Can I just say about this? And we've just recently done a program on the Duran with Michael Hudson, the economist, who's talked about all of this. And, the point he made, and he made many points, the point he made was, you're absolutely correct that cutting off Chinese, imports into the United States of electric cars is a very bad idea, given the fact that, you're denying yourself use of cheap and good electric cars. It might make sense if behind a protectionist wall you were able to set up your own industrial electric car industry. But Michael Hudson's point was that this is actually impossible in the United States today, because the entire structure of the economy, as it has developed, makes that impossible. So you are losing in every respect, because you're denying yourself a high quality product at a cheap price, but at the same time, you're not adding value, because your own industry here would not be able to take advantage of the opportunity that you think exists, because your entire economic structure makes that impossible. Now, the Chinese and the Russians have different economies, but they do have, in some ways, complementary economies and economic models, which, when you actually take a step back and look at them, they're not that different. I mean, both the Russians and the Chinese, for example, have state-controlled banking systems. The banks in Russia, state-owned. Banks in China, the big ones, state-owned. The Russians and the Chinese, big industries, nuclear power, heavy engineering, all of that kind of thing, tends to be state-owned. But of course, alongside that, they have an enormous amount of private enterprise, more in China, because they're much more further advanced in that, but it's starting to develop in Russia too. But they understand that their economies complement each other, and that's bringing them together. But again, coming back to our previous point about the United States facilitating events that are not to its own advantage, the Russians probably wouldn't have gone that way, left to themselves. They would have wanted to balance their relationship with China with a strong relationship with the West, with the Europeans. After all, Russia has long thought of itself as a part of Europe. And in some ways, their natural, cultural, and historical affinities are with Europe rather than China. The United States has achieved the situation where the Russians now say to themselves, the Western option does not exist. We've got to commit fully to the Chinese one. And now they are committing to it. And the really alarming thing for the West ought to be that now that the Russians are doing it, they're discovering that they rather like it. It actually works for them. It works well for them. And they're not all the time talked down to in the way that they're talked down to by the West. I think this is forever. I don't think this is going to change myself. And again, if the intention was to keep China and Russia divided, the US, the Biden administration has managed to bring them together.
Yeah. I know we're a bit over, but if you had time for two brief questions from viewers. So we have a Patreon subscriber, Ariel, asking, how can the narrative change so that NATO is no longer aggressive towards Russia? The rationale for making Russia a boogeyman is flawed, but deeply entrenched in Western policy thinking. Does anyone have a strategy for taking on the principles that empower NATO? So wherever you want to go with that, that's a hard one.
Well, let me start. I don't think it's possible. I think that so long as NATO exists, it is almost structurally created to lead to hostility to Russia. And, a lot of people at one time in the 1990s and 2000s hoped that it would be otherwise. But I think that we can now see that that is impossible, that so long as NATO exists, we're going to almost automatically find that it's going to lead Europe into confrontation with Russia. So the only way in which to achieve some kind of rapprochement between the Europeans and the Russians is to end NATO. I mean, I think it is as straightforward as that.
Yeah. Anything to add, Alex, to that question?
I mean, I agree. It's NATO's business model is war with Russia, conflict with Russia, tension with Russia. Keep Russia out, keep Germany down, and keep the U.S. in. And so, maybe it's not only about Russia; it's also about keeping Europe down, keeping Germany down. So that's also part of NATO's business model, and they've actually done a really good job with the keep Germany down part.
Yeah, we didn't even get into the lack of popularity of all these NATO states leaders, Germany being a big one. There was a recent article, actually, so interesting. I forget where I was reading it. Oh, it was the New York Times, their little morning shot, talking about how why are all these leaders so unpopular, and the reasons they gave were absolutely ridiculous. They're trying to really move the goalposts very far from what the behavior of these leaders and the policies of leaders, very far into, they've been leaders for a long time, except for Olaf Scholz. Weird. He's only been around for a couple of years, and yet he is terribly unpopular. But yeah, it's such a good job. I mean, Germany is just absolutely, I don't even know what to say about Germany anymore, in tatters. There's one other question, though, by Omar. They ask, if this is war, will Russia target the logistical hubs in nearby states that help Ukraine?
Well, Putin has all but said that, but of course that depends very much on an expansion of the war. He said yesterday that Russia is not looking to expand the war beyond Ukraine. But if we have a situation where, say, NATO airfields in Romania and Poland are being used to house F-16 fighter jets that attack the Russian Air Force, then the Russians will feel that they're entitled to strike at those aircraft in those Polish and Romanian airfields. I mean, he made it absolutely clear. Just as he said, if the Europeans supply long-range missiles to Ukraine, Taurus missiles, he's obviously referring to Taurus missiles, and those missiles are used to strike deep inside Russia, we reserve to ourselves the right to respond symmetrically to do the same, and we have the means to do it. So, we are starting to edge towards this. I think that these warnings of Putin's actually are having an effect. I think that European leaders are noticing them and are becoming nervous about them. They're starting to sense that the Russian military is indeed actually very strong, and that Putin means what he says. And you see that the Germans have backed off supplying the Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and the Danes are now soft pedaling the supply of F-16 fighter jets. So I think that these warnings from the Russians are actually achieving something. I hope so, anyway.
Final comments, Alex, on this?
I agree. Yeah. I think Putin's warnings are having an effect. Let's hope that they are having an effect, because I think that the Russians have been pushed to the edge with the red lines. I think the collective West has overdone it with crossing the red lines. So,
well, guys, it's been a pleasure as always. I was very happy to host both of you. Thanks so much for joining. Do you have any final comments on maybe where to find you? I do have the Duran now tagged in the video description on YouTube, and I think from there you can find everything. I know that you're all on Locals and Odyssey, Rumble, and all the rest, Telegram. So any final comments, thoughts before we end here?
Well, the Duran.locals.com and just go to the link and you'll find all our channels.
All right. Well, take care, Alex and Alexander. Stick around, everyone. I'm going to have some announcements before I leave. But thank you so much for being great guests as always. And we'll have to be back in touch as things are always developing. And take care. Good night.
Take care.
Bye. All right, everybody, that was great. I got a few announcements before I depart myself. Okay. All right. So before I leave here, and I'm gonna do that in just about a minute. A few announcements. So we are heading into April. The next live stream might be a solo stream on the 31st at the earliest. I do have Scott Ritter on April 2nd. So save the date, 8:30 p.m. Eastern. All right. Save that date, April 2nd. Then I have on August 9th, Scott Ritter will come back with Garland Nixon. So we'll have a fun stream. And then there might be one in between there or two. Not sure if I feel very active. But that's sort of the plan from here. We other than this though, my big announcements is that I am heading to China. I'm waiting for those details that I hope are coming sooner rather than later. Details of that are coming for a mid-April trip, and I will be leaving mid-April. I'll be gone for 10 days. You won't see me live likely, although there are some who really want me to stream from there, although it's super difficult given like there's like internet compatibility issues with iPhones I have that I have in the States, international service. It can get quite cumbersome. But if I can pull it off, I will try to pull it off. If I cannot, pardon me, if I cannot, you'll get videos coming out of there. I'll definitely be interviewing people who are on the trip with me. I'll try to meet up with good friends. I actually have to start working on that as well. But other than that, those are the announcements for now. We're heading into the spring season, and there is another trip. I am also working on a second trip to China. It'll be a very China-centric 2024. I am working possibly on going there at the end of this coming summer too, and that will be hopefully a very interesting trip nonetheless in regards to work, because I'm actually going to be collaborating with media out there and hopefully getting some really interesting content. Hopefully Xinjiang will be on the agenda, and hopefully I'll get some interesting interviews. I'm trying to get people who are affiliated with the military, others kind of experts out there to take interviews with me, and so we're working on that as well for July. So with all that said, everyone, the Duran was a great guest. That was a great conversation with the Duran. They're always very gracious, and talking about these global developments with them is very much worthwhile, and hopefully it was worth your time. Be sure to support this channel. You never know. There's been a lot of nefarious activity going on. Garland Nixon and I are talking about it constantly. There have been a lot of copycat channels. Every time I report one, my videos seem to end up stolen on another channel. So there's definitely an operation going on to try to limit the reach of this channel. At any given moment, the algorithm gets more and more repressive. And of course, there's always the threat of demonetization forever based on the whims of this repressive apparatus. So, with all that said, be sure to go to the video description and subscribe monetarily on places like PayPal. Patreon. Patreon is the best place to become a member, and you have a great community. As you saw, their questions are prioritized for those who are able to support me there. But there's also Substack. I do, there's also one-time options like buy me a coffee and PayPal, and all of the membership options like on Patreon and Substack. You get annual options, which hopefully are a little bit easier. And then, at least on the pocketbook. And then I just want to show you Rumble. Okay, I want to promote Rumble. I need that to become bigger. It's in the chat. Okay, I need you all to head over to Rumble before you go. I have 3,379 people watching or listening here. I would like if all 3,379 of you, or at least all of those who can get onto Rumble, I know it's banned in some places, can get onto Rumble, follow me there. Here I am, Danny Dhaiphong. I only have 3,200 or so followers there, despite the big channel that I have here. So, or bigger, much bigger channel I have here. So do so, move there as well. Don't necessarily leave YouTube, but you can do both. Okay, you can do both. YouTube, thankfully for now, I am here, and there is no imminent risk to my presence here, but you never know. And as you've seen from friends of this show, like Richard Medhurst, you could be demonetized forever, or you could be taken down forever. These are things that happen. Okay, so I'm putting it back in the chat. I'm actually going to put it here up as well. Okay, and unshare the screen. Okay, everybody. That's that. We covered a lot of ground today with the Duran. It was a great conversation, from everything from the Crocus Moscow attack all the way into the battlefields, into NATO, and then, of course, the broader geopolitical situation, which is continuing to unfurl. All right. So, with all of that said, it was a great stream. I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend, as good as can be expected. And I will be back. If you don't see me Sunday, you will see me Tuesday night with Scott Ritter, 8:30 p.m., April 2nd. Save the date. Take care. Hit that like button before you go. Subscribe to the channel. Hit that notifications bell. Check out the video description for all the ways you can support this work. And I am out. Bye-bye.